Niraj, he's done something very fascinating. He has created these giant tables tracing back lineages of families to thousands of years. He has gone through our scriptures, spoken to people. He's going to talk about how ancient our culture is. There is no other civilization in the world which has that much continuity, that much depth and breadth. So I'll hand over to Niraj.
All right, let me get started. So thank you, Vishal, for that introduction. Once again, my name is Niraj Mohanka. I run a number of websites, and they should be linked to each other, and I'm kind of always adding to this. So I get my hands in a lot of different things. I've been at this a long time. So Vishal mentioned one thing. I just want to correct a little bit. I was actually born in London. My father went to London to do a PhD in the 1960s, and right afterwards I was born there. But our family came to the US when I was 2 years old. So London, and then we came to the US, and the middle picture there on the left is Boston. Lived in the Northeast, upstate New York and Massachusetts for my whole life, basically. And then the last 2 years we moved down to Florida. So that last picture is Miami. We're north of Miami. And yes, my kids are all grown up, 32, 30, 28. So I'll be turning 57 next month. Everything that you can imagine is a team effort, right? People do not do things alone. They do things with other people, and they do things motivated by other people. So when you hear the phrase, standing on the shoulder of giants, I have many, many, many people who have influenced me, right? So you can see some of the names at the top there, Swami Vivekananda, Tarampal, Ramsuru. And remember, you can think of me, parents, you can think of me as your kids, right? I grew up in this country, and I had not a very traditional, religious family. They were not into this stuff at all. I did this completely, 100% on my own, just out of curiosity. That's literally it. As a child growing up, I heard stuff at school, I heard stuff in society. I thought it was absolutely terribly wrong, and just out of curiosity, I did my own studies. So these are some of the people I read, some of the archaeologists. You may recognize the name B.P. Lal, S.R. Rao, G.P. Singh. There's a fellow in India right now, Shrikant Talagiri, doing fantastic historical work. I put the name Francois Gautier in red. He actually is a French guy who came to India with the intention of converting Hindus to Christianity, but after living in India and learning about Dharma, he did a 180. And he became Hindu, and he married an Indian woman, and became an Indian, and lives in India. And he actually had some problems putting together a museum of real Indian history. This is a project going back like 30 years. He wanted to make something called the Hindu Holocaust Museum, because the Holocaust of Hindus was much worse than the Holocaust of Jews. Most people aren't even aware of it. It's absolutely sad that people aren't even aware of it, let alone we don't do something about it. He tried to put that museum together, and he was attacked by a local politician and his goons. Around that time, I contacted him on the internet and said, let's go about this and do it a little more smart. Long story short, he has a museum in Pune. I have my content over there, and we're working to improve that museum, and eventually we're going to make cookie-cutter museums all over India, telling the real history of India. Michelle Danino, Nicholas Kazanis. Now you'll notice down there Vishal. Vishal is what I like to call my local encyclopedia. So when I don't know things, I ask Vishal, and I don't know how he remembers it all. Rajiv Malhotra, how many people have heard of that name, Rajiv Malhotra? He's doing fantastic work. He produces a book a year. He's tremendous. And he's really challenging the academic authority. And academia is very powerful. Don't underestimate it. You could go up and say, hey, I don't like this, and people have the power almost to silence you, because they have huge political power, huge money power. So we need to topple these people. We're in the progress of doing that. It's been a 30-year battle. We've probably got 30 more years to topple them. Conrad Elst, one of my good friends, and Shankar Kush. And there's many names. I apologize if I left some off. There's so many people doing good work. All right, questions about Indian history. I don't know if the kids, you know this. I don't know what they teach you in school. They probably teach you almost nothing. But the parents, you may have heard this. How many people have heard of the Aryan invasion? Okay, people heard of it? Yeah, it's completely false. Did the Aryan invasions create the racist caste system? This is some of the nonsense they teach. It's all a divide and conquer, by the way. Are Aryans divided in two distinct races? How many people have heard this? Complete nonsense. You can actually look today with genetic studies, and you can see common Indic genes. All right, is the word Hindu an exonym? Actually, it comes after Sapta Sindhu civilization. Sapta Sindhu civilization, right? People always talk about Indus Valley, or sometimes people say Harappan, which is named after one city. It's Sapta Sindhu civilization. And by the way, we should call ourselves by the names we call ourselves. In our own texts, we say Sapta Sindhu. That's the ancient name of our civilization. Sindhu the Persians who came couldn't pronounce S. They could only say ha. So they pronounced Sapta Sindhu as Hapta Hindu. And that's where the name came from. Was the Islamic period peaceful and syncretic? Absolutely not. Absolutely. It was a Holocaust. It was a Holocaust. And it lasted for over 1,000 years, and some would say it's still going on. Was India actually invented by the British? This is such a ridiculous idea, I have a hard time even saying the sentence, but some people propose this idea. Actually, India is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. If you look at the 4 cradles of civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China. India is the oldest, because what happened to Egypt? Right? First they became Greek and Roman, then they became Christian, now they're Islamic. What happened to Mesopotamia? That's Iraq. What happened to China? It's communist. There's no religion allowed. In a communist, Marxist country, no religion allowed. So all those civilizations have fallen. They've completely collapsed. The only one standing is India. And the last one, does India have a future? I have some final slides on this, which will surprise you. All right, so let me talk about a couple things. Reality, which probably nobody presents to you. Reality. Original civilization started on rivers. Rivers were the ancient highways of commerce. Okay, and a river is where you can grow a lot of food and support a population. And that's how you get civilization. Civilization came about very slowly. It was not like somebody snapped their fingers and they became civilized. It was very slow. Humans, or Homo sapiens sapiens, we were kind of dwelling in the jungle, hunting, gathering, and doing this for a very long time, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. Slowly we became civilized. Okay, so the misunderstandings, area invasion, migration, I'll talk about this and tell you why it's not only incorrect, but what really happened is people slowly migrated out of part of India, and that's how the culture and dharma and Sanskrit and everything spread. People have equated caste with apartheid. Once again, complete nonsense, but they're using these techniques to trick people, to brainwash people, into getting them to hate each other. It's a very powerful tool. If you can trick enough people to be against each other, then you can do a divide and conquer. Okay, next thing, Saraswati River. How many people have heard of Saraswati River? How many people have heard that it's a mythical river? It's mythology, it's a story. Yeah, it was an actual river. It was actually a very powerful river. We have physical evidence of that river. You can drill underground in Rajasthan and other places and actually go down at a certain depth and collect that water. Okay, so it was a reality. Now when that river dried up or desiccated, it was a huge tragedy. Imagine if the Mississippi River dried up tomorrow. What would happen? What would happen if the Mississippi River completely dried up tomorrow? Commerce would shut down on the river because there's no river anymore, and people would leave. Some people would go to the east, and some people would go to the west. That's exactly what happened. Okay, and where are the names of people before Buddha? I don't know what school is like today, but when I was a kid in the history book, there was no names of people before Buddha. There was this vague notion that there's this Indus Valley civilization, no names, and then all of a sudden we have Buddha. Really? Really? No names. The idea I thought was so ridiculous that even as a child I had to laugh at it. Okay, now distortions. Has anybody heard the word itihas? Itihas means thus it was. It's history. It's history. And sometimes it's actually recounted in present tense. Here I am, fighting this king along this river. Here's my troops. They are their troops. Here's how the battle went. Present tense. But people describe it sometimes as mythology. Okay, and then there's some other things like the Ram banishment. I'm not going to get into all that in this presentation, but there's a lot of details that are distortions. So here's the rough chronology that I have in my timeline. Now, how did I put this together? Once again, I started with curiosity. When I got to college, I was around 18, 19 years old, so this was 1984, 1985. So in college was the first time I had access to academic libraries. So this was like a world of knowledge to me. And I started doing research and I found out, oh my goodness, there's all this history, there's all this information that is not public knowledge. Let's put this together in a simple way and let's get this out. So this is roughly my timeline. So it started with the Manvantara dynasty, or the dynasty of Manu. Then you get Emperor Bharata. So Emperor Bharata is where we get the name Bharat. Anybody hear in the news that India is officially changing the name to Bharat? That's what we call ourselves internally, right? Just like people say Deutschland internally, externally Germany. Nippon internally for Japan, externally Japan. So likewise in Bharat. Now, you'll notice there in red I put down epic 1, 2, and 3. This is probably news to most of you. Most of you have heard of 2 epics, right? Ramayana and Mahabharata. Am I right? Ramayana and Mahabharata. How many people have heard of Dasharajniya? Raise your hand. Aha! This is important. Dasha Rajniya. Dasha means 10, Rajniya means kings, or in some cases tribal chieftains. So, the War of 10 Kings. This was written up clearly in the Rig Veda and a few other texts. And I like to consider this epic number 1. And the reason why it's important to give it the status of epic is because it was a pivot point. It changed Indian history. And I would say if you change Indian history, you're changing world history. Then we get Mahavira Buddha, and notice I put down there, history begins here, question mark. In our textbooks, and I don't know what you guys have in school today, if it's the same nonsense we had, they'll make it look like the names of people in the history starts with Buddha, which is ignoring like 90% of Indian history. It's shocking. Imagine if you studied Egyptian history and you ignored every single pharaoh. It said there were some people who lived here, and yeah. So let's start with the Greeks and Romans. Emperor Ashoka, and once again, see I use the word emperor, I don't use the word king. Very specific meaning. Emperor is a different word than king. Gupta dynasty, now we get Islamic invasions, Shishya Dharma, rise of Sikhism. Early European trade, I'm going to talk about Europe, because people in India always talk about the British. Long before the British were the Europeans. And then finally political independence, which is not complete. So I took this information and I put it in, I just started writing notes on paper. And then eventually I started writing lists of names on paper. And then after many, many years I said, you know what, let me put this in an Excel spreadsheet. And I put it in an Excel spreadsheet. And then like 10 years later now, 1994, the internet comes out. And my research just skyrocketed. And I said, you know what, let me take my spreadsheets and let me start emailing it to people. And let me create some websites and post this stuff. And that's why websites have all, you can download all of this stuff. Over 300 generations, that's the link up there. I built the spreadsheet backwards. Backwards. Who did I start with? Me. I started with what I knew. I knew me, I knew my father, I knew my grandparents. I talked to my parents and grandparents and found out about previous generations, and that's how I started. I built it backwards. And I made an assumption of roughly 25 years per generation. Now today that changes. Today people are getting married later, they're having kids later, everything's changing, but for most of history, 25 years a generation is a good estimate, which means 4 generations in 1 century. I compared it to other civilizations, and it lines up very well. I did a cross-correlation of royal dynasties and priestly dynasties. All the most powerful kings had their own priests, and those priests were in families, they were purohits, and we have their lineage too. I added in different events throughout history. A lot of times when you see people studying Indian history, or just history in general, they're very obsessed with events. But events always happen in a context. A context of what happened before that event, what happened during that event, and what happened after that event. Always please keep that in mind. I synchronized this with archaeological data. I applied a little common sense. Like if we had 5 people with the same name, separated by 3,000 years, they're not the same person. So I labeled that in my chart. There might be Rama 1, Rama 2, Rama 3, Rama 4, because people had similar names. Like my name is Niraj. How many Nirajas are there in Indian history? I don't know, thousands? And then you can download this. Now, wouldn't it be nice to have a physical representation of all this history? Because as much as I like to read and I like to write, most people don't, right? I'm looking at you kids. How many of your fellow kids love to read and write? Okay, you guys are exceptions. Most kids like to watch a 5-minute video, right? They don't have the attention span to go beyond 5-minute video. So it's nice to have a physical representation of all of this. So that person I told you about, Francois Gauthier, he needed some help, so I'm helping him with his museum in Pune. It's over 5 acres. We helped him with the landscaping. An entire pavilion there is my content. And it's coming along very well. So I'm going to go over a few of those panels. So the panels, think of it like a poster. Like a 3-foot by 5-foot poster. And in each panel, I'll give a little bit of Indian history. This is an example of what some of the panels look like. And you'll see some of the incredible people in Indian history. So first of all, geography. If anybody studied geography, you know that on this planet, all these plates, all this land we're on is moving. Everything's moving. These are tectonic plates and they're moving. And what is India used to be in Antarctica. And as it broke away and started sliding up, it slammed into Asia. And it's still slamming into Asia right now. And so that's why the Himalayas are there. The Himalayas are growing. I don't forget if it's 1 millimeter or 2 or 3 millimeters a year. But the Himalayas are growing because India keeps slamming into Asia. And geography is important. Geography in some ways is destiny, right? Because India was surrounded by mountains to the north and to the northwest, and because it was surrounded by water everywhere else, it was very protected against attack. So for 4, 5, 6,000 years, India did not have any major incursions. And thus, the civilization was able to become very developed, very sophisticated, and very rich. Okay? Later on, when I say later, I mean starting around 800 BC, then you started getting some minor incursions. Oh, and by the way, talking about ethnicity. Because people were all together, and they intermarried, and they moved around, our DNA shares commonality. So you can find people from different parts of India, and there is genes you can look at that'll show, hey, this person's from South Asia or Greater India. So all this stuff about separate races is nonsense. Just because people look slightly different doesn't mean they're separate races. All right, so when does all the farming start? So there were some theories that farming was invented in one place, Mesopotamia, and then spread from there, but now we know that farming developed independently in different areas. One of the earliest places it developed was along the Saraswati River, along the western part of India, and we have that information. Also along the Ganga, we found some rice growing very, very early on. So if we go back about 10,000 years, was kind of good evidence we have of farming. Now, was there farming before then? Maybe, but we have evidence for about 10,000 years. Now we have a city, Mehrgarh. Now once again, people probably haven't talked about this much. They talk about Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, but long before then was Mehrgarh. And there you can see how well laid out the city is. You can see some little figurines. This was a city. This was not a village. This was not a town. I think at its peak it had something like over 25,000 people, which is a very large population then. How many people have heard of Bharat? Right? So notice I call him emperor. I don't call him king. Words are very important. When the British took over India, they changed every king's name to prince. Prince. Why did they do that? They subverted them because they wanted the king to be in England, or the queen to be in England, right? So words are important. Words are not unimportant. So it's emperor. So he was able to defeat a whole bunch of kings in northern India. He became powerful over them, and thus, even today, we name the country after him. He was a real person, and there is real lineage. All right, this is what I call epic number one. So written up in the Rig Veda and some other texts is what we call the War of 10 Kings. There was a descendant of Emperor Bharat, and his name was Sudas, and he was growing very powerful. And because of his power, his neighboring kings, and off in the distance, in what is today Afghanistan, tribal chieftains were very nervous. And they said, there's no way we can beat this guy, he's too powerful. So let's form a confederacy, let's all work together. All of these dozen or so, it was actually slightly more than 10, all of these dozens or so kings and tribal chieftains, and let's all simultaneously attack him. Let's attack him, let's destroy every city, let's kill him, let's take over. And guess what? They tried multiple times over a multi-year period, and he defeated them all. And his priests highly praised Sudas, and those eulogies, those praise to him, is written down in the Rig Veda. So this was a turning point of Indian history, because this dynasty, which is called the Puru Bharata dynasty, if Sudas was killed and if he lost his empire, everything would have ended there, someone else would have taken over. But he continued. So then we get the dynasty from there called the Ramayana. How many people have heard of Ramayana? Okay. How many people know there's archaeological evidence for the Ramayana? Okay, so this is not mythology, this is history. Now, when we say the word mythology or stories, think of it this way, think of it as a layer cake. A layer cake. You guys are familiar with a layer cake. Who doesn't love cake? So imagine at the bottom of it you have history. But after the event happened, people were telling stories. And over generation, the stories got bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the end of the day, thousands of years later, we remember the stories, and we forgot what the original history was. But there is an original history. Now, what is the epic after Ramayana? Mahabharata, right? Oh, wait a minute. We have to interrupt the presentation. We have to interrupt. What happened? There was an invasion. What kind of invasion? An Aryan invasion. So this is how ridiculous I feel this whole theory is. And this is essentially codified in all your history books. They say around 1500 BC, there were these Aryan people who were what? A bunch of blonde Germans? What? People who invaded. They rushed over the mountains in these horse-drawn chariots, which if anybody's been in a horse-drawn chariot, you know that's humorous. They conquered everybody. By the way, they were uncivilized savages, but they brought with them horses, chariots, Sanskrit. They brought with them Hinduism, which is nothing more than a racist caste system. And they brought the Vedas, and they brought the swastika symbol. All of this stuff is complete nonsense, but it got codified in history books, and people still eat it up today and use it for political means. So what really happened? What really happened was this. Remember I said that long before the British were the Europeans. So when the Europeans came to India, and this is now going back to like the 1400s, they listened to the languages, and they said, you know, I can hear words, a lot of words, that are very similar to our European words. Like not 5 or 10 words, but like 100 words plus that are similar to our European words. How can that be possible? How can language have that many similarities? There has to be some relation. And there's only 3 ways you can have a relationship. People from Europe went in some ancient period and came into India and brought the language. That theory was thrown out immediately because Europe was much younger. People from India went and traveled northwest and brought with them the language, and that's how the words and the language got over there. That theory was initially the most popular theory. Today we call that the out of India theory, but that was just considered common sense initially. And then there was a third theory that maybe somebody in the middle, like southern Russia, this is what we call the Caucasian Mountains. This is where the word Caucasian comes from, by the way. People in the Caucasian Mountains went both directions, to the east and to the west, and they spread their language. So initially, the idea that people from India went and took with them their language and their culture and all of this, that was the original dominant theory. Slowly over time, politics got involved and also some misunderstandings, and people said, no, there has to be a middle point. The real thing must be a middle point, and then people in both directions. Now the problem is, the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence doesn't support that. The evidence supports, if you look at, it's hard to see in the lower right there, the evidence supports people from India going outwards. And you can see that not only in the way that the words conjugate, you can see kind of the history of the conjugation of words, you can also see it through genetics. Okay? And there's also literary evidence. There's no literature in India that says people came from outside and that's who we are. But there is evidence, people in India wrote, some of our ancestors left and went this way. And by the way, the Persians have part of that history. The Persians described Sapta Sindhu as Hapta Hindu. And they said, that's where our ancestors come from. So there was a history of this in writing, very clearly, what direction people went. So people get very confused by this Aryan concept. And even today, you'll find these people who will propose this as if it's some racist theory. It's not. It's not. It's a culture. It's a language. But they'll make up this concept, oh, these were German Aryans. Actually, if anybody studies the history of Germany, you'll know that this appearance, this doesn't come from Germany. This is Nordic. All right? If you look at the right side, see that? That's a hair color of people in Europe. This blonde hair comes from Scandinavia, not from Germany. A lot of Germans have brown hair, or some have black hair. This is not, it's nothing to do with Germany, and actually has nothing to do with Scandinavia. It has to do with people from India. So if we go back in time and look at those people who migrated out of India, did they look like the guy on the left? Probably not. Did they look like the guy on the right? Probably. Okay? Now, we also talk about swastika. People say, oh, and maybe it's better now. Okay, I'm talking to you kids. Maybe it's better now. When I was a kid, it was a bad scene. It was like, oh my God, you can never say the word swastika. You can never draw the symbol because Jews will get offended. Jews will get offended. And I thought, oh, what? Then why do we have this symbol thousands of years ago? And they're talking about what happened in World War II, which is more recent. Well, what's going on here? So this symbol is a very ancient symbol. And the ones that the German have is actually called Hakenkreuz, which means a hooked cross. Okay? Hooked cross. That's actually their symbol. And they use it for what? They used it during World War II, so it's a period of 40 years. So is it fair for somebody to misuse a symbol for 40 years and that to negate over 5,000 years of someone's good usage of that symbol? Absolutely not. Look at the cross in the middle. Is the cross a symbol of evil? Is the cross a symbol of murder? Well, that's what it was for the KKK. So they denigrated a symbol that was sacred for 2,000 years, and they misused it for less than 100 years. But we don't outlaw the cross just because the KKK misused it. So we should never outlaw swastika because the Nazis misused it for a very short period of time. Okay? And this message needs to get to every single Jew in America. Here's another problem with this whole Aryan theory. It's complete nonsense. They said, well, these white people came in and they conquered the blackies, and as they intermarried with the blacks, you get some people who are off-white, some people who are beige, some people who are tan, some people who are brown, some people who are dark brown, and then some people who are never mixed or black. So they turned it into a racist theory. And then they said, well, the people at the top kept all the power. So those were the Brahmins. They kept the power. And then next to them were all the kings, the Kshatriyas. And the word Kshatriya, you notice it's very close to the English word knight, which also has the silent K, the similar word, knight. Somebody protects the land. Kshatriya, Kshatriya, somebody protects the land. Then you get Vaishyas, the people who do commerce. And then it goes down the line. So they turned what was a system of differentiation of jobs, of careers, They turned it into some crazy racist theory. All nonsense, folks. Don't buy it. All right, now that I've wasted our time on ridiculous things which you might read in textbooks or people say in public, and people say these things, and they're supposedly eminent historians or respected historians, it's complete nonsense. We've disproven all of this stuff. Okay, so next epic after Ramayana, Mahabharata. Now, how many people know we have archaeological evidence for Mahabharata? Raise your hand. So once again, these were people, these were kingdoms. This story we got is based on real history, and we have all of those locations, and we have the information about it. And it was written up voluminously. In fact, there's probably no other ancient civilization that wrote about an epic in such detail as Mahabharata. Even the Iliad and Odyssey you can fit inside Mahabharata, okay? Panini. How many people have heard of Panini? Okay, there's some theories that he was post-Buddha, but I think if you look at the data, he was clearly pre-Buddha. Because he describes kingdoms, and he describes the kings, and he describes a situation which was before Buddha. So once again, all of the stuff about our history books ignoring everyone's name until you get to Buddha is highly disrespectful. Remember that. If I say you no longer have a name, you're just a miscellaneous person, that's disrespectful, okay? And he actually formalized grammar. So there was Sanskrit long before him. A lot of people call it Vedic Sanskrit or Chandas, and he formalized it and created a whole bunch of rules. And by the way, people say he's the first grammarian. Long before the Greeks, Romans, anybody was Panini. He was an expert grammarian. How many people heard of Mahavir? Okay, so now we get to the time of Mahavir, and there's also tremendous archaeological data for that. Then we have the period of Buddha. I'm sure everyone has heard of Buddha. And by the way, Americans are, this is kind of where Americans are a little bit aware, once again, because of the whole education, academia. They're aware of Buddha. But they're not really aware of anything before that. Everything before that's kind of vague and foggy. Emperor Ashoka. How many people heard Emperor Ashoka? How many people have seen Ashoka's name with the word king in front of it? King Ashoka. Yeah, it's not a king, he's an emperor. Big difference. Emperor means there are kings who are beneath you. Kings who basically report to you, okay? Use the correct word. He was an emperor. I actually kind of admire his grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya, because he's the one who kind of made the original push, expansive empire, and then Ashoka just expanded it a little bit. Now here's what happened with Indian history, where it took a turn from Chinese history. The Chinese kept their empire pretty much intact, okay? They always kept that empire going. In India's case, the empire, after Ashoka and his children, the empire collapsed. And then we came into a period of, like, you could say, warring kingdoms. If India had maintained an empire from Ashoka onward to today, what would history have looked like? It would have been very different. But the empire fell apart. Aryabhat. How many people have heard of Aryabhat? How many people have heard of zero? Anybody here heard of zero? Anybody heard of the base 10 system? Right? Or calculation of pi? I mean, we owe so much mathematics to Aryabhat. And you notice I put a 1 after his name because there were other Aryabhats in history, okay? This is one of the panels in the museum. We couldn't do all of our computers, we couldn't do any mathematics, we couldn't do anything without these basic things, which were studied and analyzed and organized by Aryabhat. How many people have heard of Shankaracharya? So he was an amazing person. He lived a short life. And during that short life, he went all over India and he debated with everybody, and he won these debates, and he basically kept Sanatana Dharma, what we call Hinduism, he kept it alive. If it wasn't for him, it's possible that India would have become really more Buddhist. And if it had, how much resistance would there have been to later Islamic invasions? Because if you look at Afghanistan, that used to be Buddhist. What is it now, right? So I think we owe a debt of gratitude to Shankaracharya. He did incredible work, almost single-handedly saved Sanatana Dharma. And once again, changed history. How many people have heard of the Vijayanagar dynasty? Today that location is called Hampi. So it was an incredibly huge city. People fought very hard. This is all part of that Islamic colonialism. I'll call it colonialism 1.0, whereas I'll call the British colonialism 2.0. So this whole phase that lasts over 1,000 years of the Hindu Holocaust, you know, this is a real part of it. It was an incredible empire. They put up an incredible fight, and in the end, they were destroyed. Okay, Mughal Empire, I'm sure we've heard of that. Taj Mahal is a big tourist thing. And think about the marketing that goes behind this. All of us who've been to India have seen hundreds of buildings as impressive or more impressive than Taj Mahal. But the only one foreigners know about is Taj Mahal. This is marketing. This is public relations. We need to learn marketing and public relations. How many people have heard of Maratha Empire? Maratha Empire was to a large extent called the Maratha Hindu Empire. Okay? These guys went, starting from Pune in western Maharashtra, and went and conquered in many directions, and they defeated many Islamic kingdoms. Once again, they did things which other people said, well, you can't do that, and they went ahead and did it. Okay? Now, this is the part of history the Indians have forgotten, I think. Just like the Dasharajanya, Indians have forgotten it. Indians have forgotten that there were early Europeans, and they were visiting India and doing commerce and doing trade for something like 400 years before the British came. The British were late comers onto the scene. Just like here in North America, right? New York City wasn't British, it was Dutch. It was called New Amsterdam, right? And the Dutch tried to defend themselves against the British, so they built a big wall. And the British eventually broke that wall, and that's what we have called Wall Street. Wall Street, okay? So the British were latecomers. So all these different European groups were vying for commerce with India. Why? Because at this point in history, Europe was poor, and India and China were rich. Now think about this. They were poor, so they were forced to do something. So they made these terrible little boats. They were nothing compared to Indian and Chinese boats. Took a big risk. Went all over the world to do commerce, and that commerce eventually became military interactions. If India and China had the same attitude of, hey, you know what? Let's go and explore the whole world, history would have been different. We all know about British colonialism. Once again, it was at the tail end of European expansion. And the British very often had to not only fight Indians, but they had to fight other European powers to get a stronghold within India. And it was a very slow, painful process. And it started with commerce. And if you look at all the writing about India from the European perspective, it was very positive. It was glowing positive. Like they would bring back reports and say, oh my God, this country is beautiful. This country is rich. There's no slavery in this country. There's no slaves. And in our civilization, we have slaves for thousands of years. This is amazing. These people live in peace. How do they do it? They had nothing but positive things to say. Okay? But then, once it got political, and once you got governments involved, everything changed. Okay, early independence. As soon as India got independence, war. There was war in the north, war in the northeast, war all over the place. And the country was, at that point, very poor and having a tough time just feeding everybody, let alone fighting all these wars at all the borders. So, this PowerPoint presentation is almost 10 years old. So when I say, modern India, I said up to 2013, because that's when I originally put this PowerPoint. And I can't believe it's 10 years old now. So, people look at modern situation in India and they say, what's going to happen in India, right? There's so many problems happening at the same time. And once again, you can see this slide I put together in India Today from 2014-2016. And I tried to show a couple things juxtaposed. I tried to show some modern infrastructure. I showed, Modi meeting with the US, IT office parks, some good things happening. And then we talk about what is the future going to be. It's very hard to predict the future. The only thing you can guarantee is that you're going to be wrong. That's the only thing you can guarantee. Try to predict you're going to be wrong. But I think if we look at the world at a very broad sense, we see that the power that used to be in Asia and that left Asia and then went to the West is slowly shifting back to Asia. Okay? It's a slow process. It may take a few hundred years overall, but it's shifting back to Asia. And sometimes people focus on the negative things, right? They look at India and they say, oh my God, look at all these people from villages crowding into the cities, creating slums. By the way, that's a completely normal process. Anybody here read Charles Dickens? Okay, the whole history of London was like that picture on the top left. It was a gigantic slum surrounding the Queen of England who lived in a palace. That's the way cities start. They start out with people coming in from villages, they have no money, and slowly, the city gets developed. It takes a long time. We had the whole world shut down for 2 years for COVID. It was horrific. We had wars in India on the left side with Pakistan, on the right side with China. So it's very easy to look at the situation and say, man, what's the future going to hold? It looks pretty bad. But here's my take on it. And you're only going to hear this probably from me. Everybody else will hear. If you turn on the news, you're going to see negativity. If you read books, negativity. If you go on the internet, negativity. I'm probably one of the few people out there who will give you an unbelievably positive future. I think the future is going to surprise us. I think it's going to be much better than we could imagine. I think we're going to be sitting there 50 years from now looking back at today and say, who could have imagined such an incredible future? Now, why do I say that? Is it because people are magically going to become good overnight? No. I think there are going to be technological changes and there's going to be cultural changes worldwide, okay? And we can see that. India's got a very good starting point. It's the largest democracy on earth. I've already told you it's the oldest continuous civilization on earth. It has a growing economy. And the good thing about the Indian economy is India is full of business people and accountants, okay? And they are watching the numbers. They are watching every rupee, every penny. Whereas if you look at the Chinese economy, it's centrally controlled by this Marxist, fascist dictator government. And they lie, and lie. So you never know exactly what's really going on, okay? So I have much more faith in the Indian economy growing slowly and steadily, basically being very honest, versus the Chinese economy, which looks like they're going to the moon, and then they crash. And then they'll crash and they'll be down like Japan was down for like 10, 20 years. That's the way they're going to crash. I think what I'm seeing is people in India are slowly learning lessons from the past. Right? If you don't defend yourself, somebody else is going to steal your lunch. Guaranteed. Okay? I think they're learning it. And I think India's starting to take a global leadership role. If you look at the non-aligned movement, it was a failure. Part of that might have been it was too early. But we have today, we have something called the BRICS. B-R-I-C-K. How many people have heard of BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a bunch of other countries have joined. What they're all doing is essentially going behind major powers like India and saying, you know what, we're not going to base our commerce on the US dollar, we're going to trade amongst ourselves in different currencies. That might sound like a small thing, but it's earth-shattering, because it means the American empire is going down, and it's going down rapidly. And what's going to replace it is not going to be some other empire, it's going to be more of a multipolar world. So, there's two kinds of power in this world. There's hard power and there's soft power. Hard power is you go in with your guns and with your weapons and you kill everybody and you take over a country and you enslave everybody. That's hard power. Hard power always looks very good in the beginning. It looks very powerful, it looks very frightening. But if you go back later, 100 years later, whatever, it's gone. It's all gone. But what lasts is soft power. Soft power is cultural power. And that is what India has. India has unlimited reserves of soft power. And I think as that goes out to the world, I think it's changing the world. And I'm much more optimistic about soft power than I am hard power. Last line there, you see that I talk about multi-planetary future. If anybody here has watched a TV show or a movie, Star Trek or Star Wars, anybody seen that? That's what I think our future is. I really do. And I think in the future, I think those people, like if you watch Star Wars, there's actually a book called The Dharma of Star Wars. Those people are following a dharmic culture, right? It's not an Abrahamic culture, it's a dharmic culture. It's not dogmatic. It's very not only intellectual, but it's very inquisitive. People are very curious about the universe. They're going out, they're exploring, they're learning new things every day. And I really feel that's going to become the culture going forward. So that's my brief history of India. So now, I don't know how we're doing in time. How are we on time? Okay, I want to go too quickly. So let me take some questions.
So my question was about language.
Yes.
So as part of the migration or that, so I read about this hypothetical language called Proto-Indo-European,
Yes.
which I believe was created because the Europeans, when they saw the similarities, they could not come to acknowledge that Sanskrit was older than the Greek or Latin.
Yeah.
So they created this mythical super language.
Right.
Talk a little bit about how Sanskrit is older than Greek or Latin.
Okay. So a lot of Indians are against the concept of pi or Proto-Indo-European because they kind of look at it as a European invention. It's actually not. It's actually a lot of academics, and you'll find some top people like I listed in my list of Shrikant Talageri. The data appears to show that there was some sort of original language. Now that original language was not from Europe. It was not from the Caucasus Mountains or southern Russia or what we might call Ukraine. It was from India. So before Sanskrit, there was what they call Vedic Sanskrit, which some places refer to as Chandas. But what was before that? Before that was previous languages. And so we reconstruct it, like you said, it's kind of an academic exercise to reconstruct it. We can see those words and take them back. There was some root, and that root was from India. And then things evolved from there. Like if you look at all the languages, Hindi, they evolved from Sanskrit, from Prakrit, right? So you can look at what we have today and take it back in time. So it's hard to imagine going back so far. But as I said, Panini, that's maybe like 700, 800 BC. That's when Sanskrit became formalized. But Vedic Sanskrit goes back to maybe, I don't know, around 3000 BC, a little bit before then. Let's say it goes back to maximum 4000 BC. So imagine this root language goes back even before that. So maybe we could say that, and I don't know, it's complete conjecture, maybe between 10,000 BC and 4,000 or something, that's where we get this original language. So, you know, the fact that it's odd, because they say European, Proto-Indo-European. The only reason they say European is because they see a relationship with Europe, but it's not European. We should just call it PI, P-I, Proto-Indic. That's it. Or maybe Proto-Bada. That's it. That's it. Because the Europeans today have a tough time admitting that everything came from India. And by the way, if you look at migrations and when people move around the world, they don't move in all directions. It's uncommon to see people go from one city and go north, south, east, west, equal population. It doesn't happen that way. People tend to go in a certain direction, like unidirectional. And that's what happened. People went from northern and northwestern India unidirectionally to Central Asia. And then they stayed there for a while, and then those Central Asians went unidirectionally to Eastern Europe. And that's why today you can look at the genes of people in Eastern Europe and see some genes from India. Okay? Thanks for the question.
So, I mean, think about the names of states and cities and towns in the US. Mississippi, Minnesota. Now the County Road 47 has been renamed to Jankara Trail, and Lake Calhoun or Harriet has been renamed. So even though the Europeans came here 500-600 years back and decimated the local Native American population, they are just about 1.1%. But the names of the places, rivers, lakes have survived. But if you look at the whole of northern India, had the Aryans invaded from somewhere, you would have seen the original names survive in some way or the other. But even the strongest supporters of the Aryan invasion theory admit that there is not a single river all the way from Indus, all the way to rivers in Bengal or even Narmada, where there is a single name that you can say is Austric or Dravidian in origin. So all the names, you know, Shatudri, Vipasha, which is Vyas, and you know, Jhelum is a later name, but all the names have a very pure Indo-Aryan, origin. So how can this happen? You know, if we had not been native to the land, then we would have preserved the names of the older people who were there. But it's just not there. And so why should India be an exception for everything? All the rules of philology and etymology and linguistics are supposedly flouted, but we are supposed to believe that the Aryans invaded from outside.
Yeah, so there's no evidence for the theory, and there's a mountain of evidence against it. So I think at this point, the work that needs to be done is not so much academic. I think that's done. We even have good genetic data with the R1A and R1A1, and we have quite a bit of evidence. I think what's needed now is just more marketing, more public relations, changing academia, changing what people see in front of them. And so that's part of the reason why I'm working on this museum. And our goal is to get it really good shape and then kind of cookie cutter replicate it all over India. And then from the ground up, completely rewrite every textbook in India and rewrite every textbook in the world. I think it's important for the world to know the real history of India. It's a wonderful thing that this civilization is still standing today. Like people can go to the pyramids in Egypt and say, man, I wonder what those people spoke back then. I wonder what their religion was like back then. Well, what if they were still alive today and still doing that? That's what you can see in India. So that's something amazing. And I think it's hard for people to appreciate that because your school doesn't appreciate that, the society doesn't appreciate that, the people in academic power certainly don't appreciate that. But I think that can change if we all keep pushing it and repeating again and again and again. We'll make that change. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, a very nice talk. You talked about Shankaracharya, going from south to north and spreading Hindu Dharma again. There was also a network of universities, that was where the churning was happening of, sharing of intellectuals, traveling across the breadth of the country. Do you think the churning stopped, maybe 1,000 years ago, because of the reaction to the invasions? Because always, I think Hinduism as a evolving religion, they used to always take good things from wherever it would come from. Did the evolution somehow stop?
In my opinion, yes. It didn't stop and slow down, I think if everybody was so busy fighting wars that they didn't have the money to put into all of these institutions. And a lot of these institutions were leveled to the ground, right? Look at Taxila, right? What an incredible institution. I mean, people from all over the world, from the Middle East and elsewhere, from China, they came to these places. Those places are all gone, folks. They're completely gone. So imagine an invading army. Anybody here heard of Harvard University? Anybody heard of Harvard University? Okay, imagine an invading army comes in and surrounds the campus and kills everyone in the campus. All the faculty, all the staff, every single student, murders them. And then burns down every building and every book and burns it to a crisp and levels the place to the ground. How great would Harvard be after that?
Not really good.
And how much influence would Harvard have on the world after that?
Not a lot.
And after 1,000 years, we might forget what the heck Harvard was. People would say, yeah, there was some mythological university called Harvard. I don't believe it, though. So power matters. You have to be powerful. And so what happened with India is they were very advanced, but they didn't have the, I guess I'd call it like the cunning or the military techniques to understand the enemy. And I think to some extent, people in India are very good-hearted. They still don't understand these techniques. They're very devious, they're very ruthless, they're very vicious, they're very cruel, and this is how people can conquer. And I'm not talking about just a physical war, I'm talking about ideological war, taking over the media, taking over television, taking over movies. Look at Bollywood, look at what Bollywood produces. Is what is being put out by Bollywood pro or anti-dharma? Watch all these movies and think about what happens and ask yourself that question. And within months you'll say, hey, wait a minute. What's coming out of here is not very good. So that shows you where the power is. And so there's money behind the power, and they can twist things. They can take over the academic institutions. How are we doing on time? We're close to an hour? Okay. There's a phrase in India called eminent historians. Has anybody heard of that phrase? Eminent historians? Yeah, these are the people who are in some ways anti-India or, they're certainly anti-dharma. And, once again, there's an example of how control of academia is very important. Yes, you had a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Or can you speak? Okay.
I'm originally from the south.
Yes.
Right. So, will you have panels that portray an eastward push of Hindu religion? Because a lot of it is Western push.
Yeah.
Right. There's also Eastern push.
Yes.
That is very strong.
Absolutely.
Gorwat.
Yeah.
Indonesia.
Yeah.
And that whole aspect of it
Yes.
is not really covered.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, so to give you more about my museum, and I encourage everybody to visit, there's 50 panels there, 50. And I think I showed you here maybe a dozen. I think at least 2 or 3 of the panels are in South Indian kingdoms. And they basically went over and completely changed the entire culture of Southeast Asia. So if you go to, not just Thailand, but you go to Myanmar, Burma, you go to Cambodia, you go to Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of these countries were basically Hindu and Buddhist, okay? And I'll tell you something funny, I've been to Bangkok twice. And in Bangkok, if you ask somebody for directions, you know what the answer is? Okay, you go down Rama 1 Street and make a turn at Rama 2 Street, and then go down a little bit and make another turn at Rama 3 Street, and you'll end up on Rama 4 Street. I mean, they have more Hindu names in Bangkok than I think we do in India. So, was that because of the South Indian empires? Absolutely. And by the way, as I said before, the best ships in the world were Indian and Chinese. The best, biggest ships in the world, okay? European ships were lousy. I'm not saying that to insult the Europeans, it's the truth. I'm originally from Boston, and they used to have those ships out there, right? The ones that the Mayflower and all this kind of stuff. Terrible, you walk on that ship and you go, they stayed on this to cross the ocean? Are you kidding me? It's like, it's terrible, it's terrible. All those people had was guts, but they did not have technology. Now, India and China didn't take those gigantic ships and go all over the world like they should have. South Indian Empire did, but they went to Southeast Asia. But the South Indian Empire didn't go all over Africa, all over Europe. They didn't go everywhere, right? And same thing with Chinese, they didn't. And I think the reason why, if we look at what we have for the literature, a lot of the people in India and China were so rich that they became a little bit conceited. They thought, we are civilized. Everybody else in the world is a bunch of poor, dirty savages. I don't want to go there. Let them come here. So you see, the lesson of history is you've got to go out. And yes, you're right. South Indian kingdoms absolutely went out and had a huge influence on Southeast Asia. And not only do we have the shipping evidence and the name evidence and the religious evidence, we also have coins. There are a lot of coins from this kingdom. So I have got at least 2 or 3 panels in the 50 panels, 50 panels that actually goes over that. Yeah, that's an important part of Indian history. And it's a very important part of Indian history because people might say stupid things like, well, Indians never went anywhere else. Actually, they did. Actually, they did. I would have liked them going even more, but actually they did. Is there another question? Yes?
In one of your earlier slides, there was, you had Hinduism and then in parentheses something about racism. Can you explain that? Maybe I misunderstood it.
Yes. So one of the techniques of obtaining power in this world is what they call divide and conquer. So get people at each other's throats. The more you can get people to fight with each other, the more all of their energy is consumed in inner fighting and hatred. And so they did that in India. They took this varnashram dharma system, which was an elaborate system, okay, of your stages of life, your ashrams, and the different jobs you do, your occupations, which is jati and varna, and they turned it into this thing called caste system, and they made it racist. They said, well, these Aryan whites conquered, and the blacks were the locals, and then they intermarried and you get these different colors. They turned it, they invented a racist system. Even to this day, you can find some black groups in America that will say that the lower castes in India are like the blacks of India. They turn everything racist. The goal is to get everybody to fight with everybody. It's complete nonsense. There's no science to it, but it works in getting everybody to fight with everybody. I don't know if that answers your question.
And who is they?
I'm sorry?
Who is they?
Oh, who is they? Who is they is the people who control academia, I think, is primarily, and also people who control the media. So if I watch TV and they put a certain spin on information, right? And I look at it and say, why are they putting that spin on it? It's because somebody has an objective and they've hired CNN or they've hired somebody to put the spin on it. And very often you'll see the other side doesn't even get to air their voice. They're not even given a voice. So this is power. This is power. If I can control the media, if I can control academia, every single textbook, if I can control what's on TV, if I can control most of the websites, if I go on YouTube or I go on Twitter, which is now X, and I post something and they don't like it, they can kick me off. But what if I post something that's maybe pro-Hindu and they say, well, you know, he's a Hindu fundamentalist right-wing radical. And I say, no, I'm just Hindu. Am I allowed to post this? No, you're not. So this is power. So when I say they, it's not anyone they, it's just amorphous people who have power, want to maintain their power, and they control the message that gets out. And I've been at this over 30 years, and so has Vishal. We've seen it with our own two eyes. It's amazing. When you have power, you can get people to shut up. And when you have power, you can make people do things. You can say jump, and somebody jumps, because they're working for you. They get salary from you. They're a professor at Harvard, and if they say anything, they could be in trouble. They could lose, and they would be negating all of their work for the last 30 years. They don't want to do that. So they'll kind of continue doing what they're doing, even if there's counter evidence. It's like a system. I know, it's kind of weird, right? That's the way things work.
So all the parents who are sitting here, I would really urge you to take your children to India as frequently as you can, because they read a lot of negative stuff in Reuters and Bloomberg and New York Times and Washington Post. But when they actually see the ground reality, their eyes are opened that India is not becoming like Nazi Germany, where billions of people are going to be sent to gas chambers. It's just very ridiculous propaganda. The second thing about racism is anybody who thinks that our culture is racist only needs to make one trip to our mandir upstairs. So at the Jagannath shrine, you'll see Krishna, who's dark, with his brother who's white and sister who's yellow, the three main colors of the humanity. You know, Lord Krishna himself is dark, Bhagwan Ram is dark, Vishnu is dark, and Shiva is both dark and white. So all the colors are represented in our deities, and we all bow uniformly to them, and all colors are beautiful. It's, you know, you were talking about blondism, and so if our forefathers were all blue-eyed and blondes, then, you know, why would we, so imagine, you know, amongst Indians, if there is out of 1,000, one person who has blonde hair and blue eyes, then you would have a nickname which represents, you know, that it's a rarity. And so you would call that blonde person. So likewise, amongst the thousands of rishis we had, there was one rishi who had light hair, and the name was Hiranyakashi Satyashar. Why would you, if all the rishis were blonde and blue-eyed, why would you have only one rishi named Hiranyakashi, person with light yellow golden hair? So, you know, we, all this thing about, you know, light color and Europeans coming and creating our culture is not attested by facts. Then the thing about horse and horse chariots. If you read the Vedas, they mention the woods which are used for constructing chariots. All those trees are found only in the Indian subcontinent. Have you ever seen Egyptian panels showing pharaohs fighting on chariots? Now the Egyptians learned the art of chariot making from people in Lebanon and Israel, the Hittites. And if you read the hieroglyphics, their woods for making chariots were all Lebanese cedar and other woods which are imported, because that's where they got their technology from. So had we learned the art of chariot making from Aryans who came from Central Asia, we would have continued using wood materials from Central Asia, but that's not really true. Now China also imported chariot technology, and if you read their manuals on chariotry, they still mention the Indian woods. If you read the manuals on chariotry in Western Asia, they use technical terms, ek vartan, dvit vartan, which are Sanskrit terms, 1 round, 2 rounds, and they name their horses as pingar, which is a very pingar horse, a yellow-brown horse. So, to say that all these things came from Europe is just, the facts are totally contrary to that.
And I'll tell you something else that's kind of unrelated but funny. So I live in Florida, and right behind me is Polo Grounds. It's considered the winter equestrian capital of the world. So all these rich people come down in the winter and they play polo. And so, you can do tailgating. So I've done tailgating and watched some polo matches. And the terms are like Indian terms. So each round that they play is called chakra. So words don't change, right? People keep some words and they just keep using it, and that's part of polo. A lot of the other terms, there were Indian terms in polo. So, other questions? You have a question?
Yes. This is about history. So
Okay.
I see that you gave the period of Rama and Krishna about 1,500 years difference or around that. But what I hear is like Rama's birth was around 7,500 years before now,
Yeah.
and about 5,000 years before was Krishna.
Right.
So does your history timeline match accordingly, or what's your evidence?
Yes. So this is a great question about the length and the breadth of chronology. So think of my timeline as an accordion, and that accordion can be brought closer or it can be pushed back. I've been at this now over 30 years. I've had plenty of opportunities to bring it forward or to push it back. Mostly push it back. Because there's a lot of people who will say, well, the Mahabharata was 3100 BC, and the Ramayana was, 5,000 or 7,000 BC. But if you ask those same people, when was the Dasharajna? And they'll say, the Dasha what? So that tells me, okay, end of discussion. You don't even know Indian history, right? Because that was really very well attested in the Rig Veda. That was a turning point of Indian history. A lot of these things that I put are based on the chronologies we have from our literature of the kings, and you have to download that spreadsheet and spend some time. There's no gaps. Okay, we know the whole list of kings, all the way from the beginning down to me. We know all the lists of priests. Those things don't align with 5, 7, 9, 20,000 BC. They do not. Unless people back then lived 500 years long. Okay, unless they lived that long, it does not align. It doesn't align with the archaeological dates too. And I know carbon dating is not great. There are errors in it. But there's many different types of dating techniques, and they're all roughly lined up with what I showed you here. Also, we have people in India who've gone abroad, and we have people who are foreigners who come to India, and that lines up with this chronology. So the whole history of India fits very neatly within about 6,000, 7,000 years of named history. And the whole history of civilization, of people building cities, fits very neatly within about 10 to 12,000 years. It does not go before then. If someone shows me solid evidence before then, I'm happy to take a look at it. I'm always happy to change anything based on new data. The only new data, honestly, I've seen in the last, say, 20 years is genetic data. And the genetic data is really amazing. It shows that Indians are basically Indian, and that the foreign genetic element is like 5%, we're 95% Indian, and it also shows that Indians went out of India and spread some of our genes in the outward direction. Almost none in the other direction. So to answer your question on the time frames, that's what the data shows.
So we've run out of time, and give a big applause to the speaker. We're talking about the Battle of 10 Kings. One way to remember that is if you've heard about the movie Gadar 1 and Gadar 2, that Battle of 10 Kings was also fought on the banks of Ravi, where Lahore is located. So that was Gadar 0, if you can remember it that way. So the kings from the western side were defeated by the King Sudas of northern India, and he laid the foundation of the Hindu civilization. So thank you once again for flying in all the way from Florida and enjoying the weather and the color of leaves here, fall here.